Welcome, listeners. Welcome to another story from ancient pasts, The Sword of Kagehira, Chronicles of the Last Ronin. Prepare to journey through ancient Japan, where honor, betrayal, and the weight of a legendary sword shape the fate of a fractured land. Join Tetsuo, the Last Ronin, as he battles dark forces, uncovers secrets, and fights to protect the legacy of Kagehira no Tsuba. Thank you for tuning in. Let the story begin. The morning air in Kagehira was thick with the scent of pine, the kind of smell that lingered in your lungs and reminded you of the deep roots of the earth, of time itself. The sun had not yet risen, but the sky was already pale with the promise of a new day. The villagers were still asleep, nestled in their homes made of timber and thatch, nestled like fragile birds in the stillness of the mountains. At the edge of the village, a solitary figure stirred. Tetsuo was awake before the dawn, as he had been for the past decade. He never needed the light of day to rise. His body was attuned to the quiet hours before the world came alive. The sounds of the forest, the rustling of the trees in the wind, the chirping of distant birds, these were his companions. And always, in the back of his mind, was the weight of the blade he had hidden for so many years. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba. It was said that the sword was forged by a master swordsmith during the Age of Warring States, a time when the land was soaked in blood, and men died for a piece of land or a title. Lord Okamoto, the former ruler of Kagehira, had wielded it with grace and ferocity. But after the battle that ended his life, when the Takeda clan had overthrown his house, the sword had been lost to history. Or so the world believed. Tetsuo had kept it hidden in the secret chamber beneath his forge, buried beneath layers of iron, coal, and stone. He had vowed never to let it see the light of day again, for fear of the dangers it could bring. But deep down, he knew that it would one day resurface, that it would once again find its way into the hands of those who would wield its power for their own gain. The clang of hammer against anvil filled the forge as Tetsuo began his work for the day. His calloused hands, though worn from years of labor, moved with a practiced grace, shaping the steel with the precision of a master. He was known throughout the village for his skill, and his blades were among the finest in the region. Yet despite his expertise, it was the ancient sword that consumed his thoughts. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. The forge. Tetsuo paused, his hammer raised mid-swing, listening intently. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if the person was unsure of whether they should enter. Tetsuo wiped the sweat from his brow and glanced toward the door. A figure appeared in the dim light of the morning. It was a man dressed in the garb of the shogunate, a dark kimono embroidered with the insignia of the imperial army. His face was stern, his eyes cold. Tetsuo recognized him immediately. Lord Takeda's messenger. Tetsuo muttered under his breath. The man stepped inside, his presence filling the small forge. There was an air of authority about him, but also something else, something darker, as if he carried a weight that he could not escape. "Tetsuo," the man said, his voice gravelly. "You are summoned by the shogunate." Tetsuo's heart skipped a beat. He had expected trouble, but not so soon. "Summoned?" He echoed, his voice calm despite the storm brewing inside him. "For what purpose?" The messenger's eyes flicked toward the forge, and Tetsuo could see the unease in the man's posture. "The shogunate requires your presence at the imperial court. You are to bring the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba." The words hit Tetsuo like a strike from a blade. His stomach churned with unease, and his fingers tightened around the handle of the hammer. He had known this day would come. He had known that the sword would once again attract the attention of those who sought power. But hearing the words aloud, spoken so casually, made the weight of it all feel unbearably real. "I have no sword to bring, Tetsuo replied, his voice steady, though his thoughts raced. The Sword of Kagehira was lost long ago. It is no longer in my possession. The messenger's eyes narrowed. You lie, Tetsuo. We know the sword is in your possession. The court demands it. Tetsuo stood tall, his face betraying none of the turmoil he felt inside. He had sworn an oath to protect the sword, and yet, at this moment, the reality of that vow seemed impossible to fulfill. What would become of him if he refused? Would they destroy the village? Would they take his life? I will not be a pawn in your schemes, Tetsuo said coldly, his eyes hardening. I am no longer a samurai. I owe no allegiance to the shogunate. The messenger's hand tightened on the hilt of his sword, a subtle threat that did not go unnoticed. If you refuse the shogunate's command, there will be consequences, Tetsuo, and I will not be the only one to seek you. The messenger turned and left the forge without another word. Tetsuo stood frozen, the hammer still in his hand, his mind racing. The sword was no longer a symbol of his lord's legacy. It had become the fulcrum of an empire's power struggle. Tetsuo could feel the pull of fate tightening around him, dragging him toward a future he had hoped to avoid. Later that day, as Tetsuo sat in the stillness of his forge, he felt the weight of the situation bearing down on him. He had no choice. The sword could not remain hidden any longer. The messenger's words echoed in his mind. We know the sword is in your possession, but how did they know? Who had betrayed him? Tetsuo closed his eyes, recalling the years of peace since Lord Okamoto's death. The village had been quiet, untouched by the chaos that raged in other parts of Japan. But now, everything had changed. The Takdata clan's greed had been stirred, and with it, the rest of the country would follow. The sword had always been a symbol of power, but now it was a curse. He had no intention of surrendering it to the shogunate. Not to Lord Takeda, not to anyone. The sword was his responsibility, and it was time to prepare for what was to come. Tetsuo stood and made his way to the hidden chamber beneath the forge. The air grew colder as he descended into the dark, the only sound the echo of his footsteps. The chamber was small, its walls lined with weapons of every shape and size. But it was the stone pedestal in the center that drew his attention, and on that pedestal rested the blade, the Sword of Kagehira, no Tsuba. It was an ancient weapon, its steel worn and etched with the symbols of forgotten times. The hilt was wrapped in worn leather, and the guard, shaped like a lion's mouth, glinted in the dim light. Tetsuo's fingers brushed the blade's edge, and he could feel the power it contained, the weight of history behind it. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his hand resting on the hilt, his mind filled with the ghosts of his past. The sword had once been a symbol of honor, of protection. But now, it was a symbol of war, a weapon that could change the course of history. Tetsuo closed his eyes, the decision clear. He would not hand over the sword, but the path ahead would be fraught with danger. The shogunate would stop at nothing to claim it, and Tetsuo could not protect the sword alone. As he left the chamber, a sense of resolve filled him. He would find allies. He would protect the sword, and he would uncover the truth behind the betrayal. That had led the shogunate to seek it out. With the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba hidden once more, Tetsuo began to prepare for what would come next. He knew that the world outside Kagehira was changing, and that his quiet life as a blacksmith was no longer possible. The shogunate's reach extended far, and the Takeda clan's ambition knew no bounds. It was only a matter of time before they came for him. But Tetsuo would be ready. The day was drawing to a close as Tetsuo sat by the dim light of a fire in the quiet solitude of his small home, the glow flickering across the rough-hewn wooden walls. The last embers from his forge still glowed, and the smell of iron lingered in the air. He had spent the evening alone, his thoughts consumed by the events of the day. He had not been able to shake the messenger's words from his mind. The sword must be returned. The weight of the message pressed heavily on his chest, and in the silence of his home, he could almost hear the whispers of fate itself closing. And around him, he was no longer the man he had been years ago, when the world seemed simpler, when he had walked the path of the samurai in service to Lord Okamoto. That life, that honor, was gone. The land had changed, and so had he. He had cast off the armor of a samurai, shed the mantle of a lord's vassal, and embraced a quieter life as a blacksmith. But now, that life was under threat. His past had come crashing back, and with it, the sword, the very symbol of his former service, now a token of both great power and great danger. The fire crackled and popped, pulling Tetsuo from his thoughts. He could feel the weight of the decision looming over him like a storm cloud. He could not simply hide the sword forever. He knew that it would eventually come to light, that someone, somewhere, would find out. And if the shogunate was as intent on recovering it as the messenger claimed, the threat would only grow. The entire nation could be plunged into war again, all because of the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba. Tetsuo rose from his seat and walked to the corner of the room where his old armor hung, the worn steel battered from countless battles. He had not worn it in years, but the sight of it stirred something in him, a sense of duty, of obligation to a time long past. He had abandoned this life, but now it seemed inevitable that he would need to take up the sword once more. He unfastened the armor and began the slow process of donning it. The weight of the pieces was familiar, the cold metal comforting. Each piece fit with the precision of a life spent training, a life spent in the service of someone greater than himself, a life he had sworn to protect. Tetsuo's hand hovered over the hilt of the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba. Its blade gleamed faintly in the firelight, a silent reminder of the past he had tried to escape. A memory of Lord Okamoto's face, calm and resolute, flashed in his mind. Okamoto had been a man of honor, a man who led with wisdom and strength, and Tetsuo had sworn an oath to protect him. But now, that oath felt like a burden, a chain pulling him back into the chaos that had claimed his lord's life. His fingers tightened around the sword's hilt. It was a symbol of loyalty and duty, yes, but it was also a symbol of power, a power that could be used for both good and ill. Tetsuo had once believed that the sword would protect the people of Kagehira, but now it was a weapon sought by those who would use it for their own gain. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. The sword could be a force for peace, but it could also tear the land apart. And yet, Tetsuo could not let it fall into the wrong hands. He had made a promise to Okamoto, and though his lord was dead, that promise still bound him. A knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. Tetsuo's hand went instinctively to his sword, and he moved to the door cautiously, his senses alert. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his mind racing with the possibilities of what the shogunate's messenger might have meant. But when he opened the door, it was not the messenger who stood before him. It was a familiar face, an old friend from his time as a samurai. "Yamato," Tetsuo said, his voice steady despite the surge of emotions he felt at seeing his old comrade. Yamato had been one of Lord Okamoto's most trusted generals, a warrior of great skill and loyalty. He had been at Okamoto's side during the final battle, and though he had survived, his spirit had been broken by the loss of their lord. "Tetsuo," Yamato replied, his voice weary, but his eyes burning with the fire that Tetsuo hadn't seen in years. "I heard the news. The shogunate is searching for you." Tetsuo nodded grimly. "I've already received their message. They want the sword." Yamato's eyes flicked toward the interior of the house, toward the room where Tetsuo had hidden. "The blade. I take it you haven't given it to them." "Of course not." Tetsuo replied. "It's not theirs to take." Yamato stepped into the room, his expression somber. "I'm not here to advise you to give it to them, Tetsuo. But you need to understand the consequences of refusing." Tetsuo's brow furrowed. "I know the risks. The shogunate will not stop until they get what they want." Yamato nodded, his gaze fixed on the fire. "The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba is more than just a weapon. It's a symbol of power that can either unite or destroy this country. And there are those who will do anything to claim that power. The Takeda clan, the shogunate, they'll tear the country apart if they have to. And they will come for you, Tetsuo." Tetsuo clenched his fists. "They can come for me, but I will not let them take what doesn't belong to them." Yamato placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this, my friend. I still owe a debt to Lord Okamoto, and I've spent years watching the Takeda clan grow stronger, waiting for the right moment. If you're willing to stand against them, I'll stand with you." Tetsuo met his old friend's gaze. There was no hesitation in Yamato's eyes, only the quiet determination of a warrior who had seen too much bloodshed to ever turn away from a fight. Tetsuo knew that Yamato's offer was not just a gesture. It was a promise, one that would bind them both to a path that would lead them through countless battles, through a war that could shake the very foundations of Japan. "I cannot do this alone," Tetsuo said, his voice steady but filled with a sense of finality. "We must find others who are willing to fight with us. The Takeda clan will not stop. And neither will I." Yamato smiled, his eyes bright with the fire of battle. "Then let us gather those who still honor the old ways. We will not let the sword fall into the wrong hands." The decision was made. Tetsuo had chosen his path, and the war that had once seemed distant now loomed ever closer. The Takeda clan would stop at nothing to claim Kagehira no Tsuba, and the shogunate's agents were already moving against him. But Tetsuo was no longer the man he had been. He was not just a blacksmith, and he was not just a ronin. He was a warrior with a purpose, an oath to uphold. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Tetsuo and Yamato began to prepare for the coming storm. They would need to move quickly, gathering allies and striking before the Takeda clan could consolidate its power. The sword had to be kept safe at all costs. With Tetsuo's vow to protect the sword and his commitment to the oath of his former lord, the stage was set for a conflict that would not only shape the fate of Kagehira, but of all Japan. The battle for the sword was not just a battle for power. It was a battle for the soul of the country itself. The days following Tetsuo's decision were filled with urgency, and the once peaceful village of Kagehira became a place of quiet, hidden tension. The murmurs of the coming storm could be heard among the villagers, though none of them knew the full scale of the events unfolding. Only a few, like Tetsuo, knew that the old ways, the ways of the samurai, and their unwavering loyalty were being stirred once more by the threat of war. And now, the past was forcing its way into their present. Tetsuo and Yamato set to work immediately, preparing for what was to come. They met in secret, away from the prying eyes of the village, gathering what little information they could about the Takeda clan's movements. Yamato, despite his weariness, proved to be an invaluable source of knowledge, having spent years on the outskirts of the Takeda's influence. He had seen firsthand their ambitions, and he knew the lengths to which they would go to claim the sword. The Takeda clan, once a formidable force in the days of the warring states, had fallen into the hands of a new generation of warlords, each more ruthless than the last. Their current leader, Takeda Kiyomori, had one goal above all: to restore his clan to its former glory. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was the key to that goal, a symbol of power that would elevate the Takeda clan above all others. But Tetsuo had sworn an oath to his late lord, and he would not let that sword fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own gain. By night, they gathered others, those who still clung to the old ways, those who had sworn loyalty to Lord Okamoto, and who had watched with growing unease as the country around them descended into chaos. These were the men and women who had been left behind, the remnants of the once proud samurai order who had lost their purpose with the death of their lord. Now they would have a new purpose. One by one, Tetsuo and Yamato found those who still remembered the honor of the sword. An old archer named Takada, no relation to the clan, a former retainer of Lord Okamoto, joined them. A woman named Ayumi, once a healer who had cared for the warriors of Kagehira, stood by their side. And even a few young villagers, men and women who had been raised on the stories of the old samurai, came forward, ready to take up arms. Together, they formed a small but determined group, bound by a common purpose: to protect the Sword of Kagehira, no Tsuba, and to prevent the Takeda clan from claiming it. They knew that they were vastly outnumbered, that the Takeda clan's forces were far stronger, but they also knew that the sword was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of the old ways, the ways of honor and duty, and they would fight to protect that symbol, even if it cost them their lives. It was the morning after the meeting when the first sign of trouble arrived. Tetsuo had been working in his forge as usual, the rhythmic hammering of iron the only sound. In the quiet village, when a rider appeared on the road leading into Kagehira, the rider was cloaked in the black of the Takeda clan's colors, his horse moving with an unsettling speed. The man rode straight to the center of the village, dismounting with a practiced fluidity that told Tetsuo everything he needed to know. The man was no mere messenger. He was an agent of the Takeda clan, sent to scout the village and search for any signs of rebellion. Tetsuo knew that the Takeda clan's reach had grown far and wide, and their agents were everywhere. It was only a matter of time before they discovered the secret of the sword. As the man approached, Tetsuo stepped out from the forge, wiping his hands on his apron. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive. The man's eyes scanned the village, lingering for a moment on Tetsuo before he continued his path toward the heart of Kagehira. "Who are you?" Tetsuo called out, his voice calm, but with a sharp edge. The rider stopped, turning slowly to face Tetsuo. His eyes were cold, calculating, eyes that had seen many battles, many deaths. He was not a man to be underestimated. "I am Ruji," the rider said, his voice low and steady. "I have been sent to ensure that this village is not harboring any traitors." Tetsuo's heart sank. He had suspected that it would come to this, that the Takeda clan would send agents to search for him. But hearing the words spoken aloud made the reality more immediate, more dangerous. He could not afford to reveal himself. "Not yet. There are no traitors here," Tetsuo replied, his voice flat, offering no sign of the tension he felt building within him. "This is a simple village. We have no interest in your clan's affairs." Ruji's gaze lingered on Tetsuo for a moment longer, studying him with a penetrating intensity. "I do not believe you," Ruji said finally. "The Takeda clan knows that something is amiss. We will search this village, and we will find what we are looking for." Tetsuo's heart raced. He knew that the search would not end here. Ruji would not stop until he had discovered the truth. The sword was still hidden beneath the forge, but it would not remain there for long. As Ruji turned to leave, Tetsuo's thoughts raced. He had to act quickly. Yamato would need to be warned, and the others would need to take their positions. The Takeda were here. The hunt had begun. Tetsuo spent the rest of the day preparing. He moved through the village with quiet urgency, making sure that the others were ready for what was to come. They would need to move swiftly, and they would need to rely on their old skills. This was not a battle they could win through strength. Alone, they would need strategy, stealth, and a deep understanding of the land. As night fell, Tetsuo and his small group gathered in the forest outside the village. They stood in a clearing, their faces shadowed beneath the trees. There was no need for words. Their shared purpose was enough. They were ready. Tetsuo could feel the weight of the coming battle pressing down on him, the responsibility of the sword heavy on his shoulders. But in the faces of his companions, he saw the same resolve. They had all been called to this fight, whether they had sought it or not, and they would stand together. The battle would be fierce. The Takeda clans. Agents were close, and the shogunate's reach stretched even further. But the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was not just a weapon, it was a beacon, and those who sought it would never rest until it was theirs. The night was silent, the forest around them dark and still, but in the distance, the faintest sound of hooves reached Tetsuo's ears. The Takeda were already moving. "We must move now," Tetsuo whispered. "We will face them in the valley. If we're to protect the sword, we have to make our stand there." His companions nodded, and together they melted into the shadows of the forest, prepared to face whatever lay ahead. The fate of Kagehira, the sword, and their very lives hung in the balance. The Takeda were relentless, and there would be no mercy. But as the wind whispered through the trees, Tetsuo felt a stirring in his heart. This was the moment, the last stand. Would it be enough? The forest was dark and dense, the trees towering above like silent sentinels, their branches whispering in the wind. Tetsuo's heart pounded in his chest as he moved with quiet determination through the underbrush. The weight of the sword, hidden within his cloak, felt like a living thing, pulling at him, demanding attention. His every step was measured, each movement calculated. They could not afford to make a sound, not with the Takeda agents closing in. Behind him, his companions followed in the same eerie silence. Yamato led the way, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow, every rustle of the trees. He knew the art of war better than most, and his presence brought a sense of calm to Tetsuo's frayed nerves. The others, Ayumi, Takeda, and the young villagers, kept close, their weapons at the ready, their faces set in grim determination. Tetsuo's mind, however, was elsewhere. It was not the Takeda agents he feared the most. No, the true threat lay in the heart of the valley, where the ruins of Lord Okamoto's estate still stood, like a monument to a time that was now lost. The estate had once been a proud symbol of the Okamoto family's power, but it had fallen into decay after the defeat of Lord Okamoto at the hands of the Takeda clan. The battle that had shattered Kagehira's house had also destroyed the village's heart. The ruins of the Okamoto estate had become a cursed place, a hollow shell of what it had been. Yet for Tetsuo, it was a sacred ground, a place where he had sworn an oath to protect his lord and his people. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba had been forged within those walls, and it was there, in the shadow of his fallen lord's home, that the battle for its future would unfold. The journey through the forest was long and treacherous, but Tetsuo's mind remained focused on the task at hand. The Takeda agents were not far behind, their presence a constant, gnawing feeling in the pit of his stomach. It was only a matter of time before they discovered their hiding place. The Takeda had eyes everywhere, and if they were going to make a stand, it had to be now. At last, they arrived at the valley. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the ruins of the Okamoto estate, its crumbling walls and shattered pillars rising from the ground like broken teeth in the mouth of a dead giant. The once magnificent home was now little more than a ruin, a shadow of its former glory. The roof had collapsed long ago, and the wooden beams had rotted with age. But despite its decay, the estate still held an air of majesty, as if the spirits of those who had lived there still lingered in the cold stone. Tetsuo stood at the edge of the ruins, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For a moment, he allowed himself to look upon the remains of his lord's house. His mind flashed back to the day of the battle. The screams, the blood, the smoke that had choked the sky. He remembered Lord Okamoto's final command, the promise that Tetsuo had made to protect the sword and to avenge the fall of their house. That promise had been his life's purpose, and now it would come to fruition. Yamato approached him silently, his face grim. "We have to make our stand here," he said, his voice low. "The Takeda will not hesitate to destroy this place." Tetsuo nodded, his jaw clenched. "I know. We will fight here, in the place where it all began." The others gathered around them, forming a loose circle in the shadows of the ruined estate. The valley stretched out before them, a wide, open space that would give them little cover against the Takeda forces. It was a poor place to make a stand, but there was no choice. The sword had to be protected, and they had no other option. "We cannot hold the valley forever," Yamato continued. "We must draw them into the ruins. There, we have the advantage." Tetsuo nodded again, his mind already working through the plan. "Ayumi, Takaya, you will take the rear. Watch for any movements. If they flank us, you will make sure they cannot retreat." Takeda, the grizzled archer, gave a short nod. "Understood." Ayumi, her face pale but resolute, stepped forward. "And what of you, Tetsuo? Where will you be?" Tetsuo's eyes hardened. "I will draw them in. If they want the sword, they will have to come through me." A moment of silence passed before. Yamato spoke again. "We will fight together. For Okamoto, for Kagehira." The group nodded, their faces set in a grim, determined resolve. There was no turning back now. The Takeda clan was coming, and they would not stop until they had what they wanted. Tetsuo had no illusions about the danger they faced. The Takeda were a powerful force, and their reach was long. But in this moment, standing in the ruins of his lord's home, Tetsuo felt a deep, unshakable sense of purpose. This was where the battle would be won or lost. The sounds of hooves in the distance reached Tetsuo's ears, faint at first, but growing steadily louder. The Takeda were close. Too close. "Positions," Tetsuo barked. "Take your places." The group moved quickly, melting into the shadows of the crumbling walls. Tetsuo felt the weight of his sword at his side, its cool steel a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was not just a weapon. It was the key to everything. It was the key to Kagehira's future, or its destruction. Tetsuo took his place at the center of the ruins, where the courtyard had once been. The floor was cracked and uneven, the remnants of what had once been a garden now choked with weeds and overgrowth. But this was where he had stood with Lord Okamoto all those years ago, where they had trained together, where they had made their plans. This place, this ground, was sacred to him. He took a deep breath and drew the sword from its scabbard. The blade gleamed in the moonlight, its surface smooth and flawless. It was a beautiful weapon, forged for a time of war, for a time of honor. It was a reminder of everything that had been lost, and everything that could still be regained. The sound of hooves grew louder, and Tetsuo's grip tightened on the sword. The Takeda were coming. The Takeda force emerged from the darkness of the valley, their armor glinting in the pale light of the moon. They were a formidable sight, dozens of warriors, clad in black, riding horses that moved with the grace of predators. At their head was Ryuji, the man who had confronted Tetsuo earlier that day. His eyes were hard, his face set in a mask of cold determination. Tetsuo could feel his heart race, but his resolve never wavered. He had been trained for this moment. He had been trained for war, for battle, for the defense of his lord and his people. And now it was time to face the enemy. "Draw your weapons," Tetsuo shouted, his voice carrying across the valley. With a roar, the Takeda warriors charged forward, their swords raised high. Tetsuo stepped forward to meet them, his own blade gleaming in the night. He knew this battle would not be easy, but he was ready. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment to fulfill his oath. The sword of Kagehira no Tsuba would not fall into the wrong hands. The clash of steel rang through the valley as the Takeda forces charged forward, their war cries piercing the cold night air. Tetsuo stood at the center of the ruins, his sword poised and steady, ready for the battle that had been building in the shadows for years. The ground beneath his feet trembled as the Takeda cavalry thundered closer, their horses' hooves kicking up the dust and stones of the ruined estate. Tetsuo's heart raced, but his mind was clear. There was no room for fear, no room for hesitation. He had taken an oath to protect the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba, and he would honor it, no matter the cost. The first wave of Takeda warriors descended upon him with the fury of a storm, their swords raised high. Tetsuo's grip tightened on the hilt of the ancient blade, its weight and power now familiar in his hands. He stepped forward, his movements swift and precise, cutting through the air with the grace of a dancer and the deadly accuracy of a master. His sword met the first enemy's blade with a loud clash, sparks flying as steel met steel. The Takeda warrior staggered back, momentarily disoriented, but Tetsuo was already moving, his sword a blur as it sliced through the air. He pivoted, striking with the precision of years of training, his blade cutting through armor and flesh alike. The first man fell, his life extinguished in an instant. But Tetsuo knew that this was just the beginning. The Takeda were relentless, and there were more of them. He could hear their war cries growing louder, their numbers swelling like a rising tide. From the corner of his eye, Tetsuo saw Yamato and the others taking their positions. Yamato, with his unmatched skill in the art of war, was already cutting down Takeda soldiers with ruthless efficiency. His broad sword swept through the air, cleaving through the enemy's ranks with ease. Takeda, the archer, had taken a high vantage point among the ruins, his bow singing death as he picked off the enemy from afar. Ayumi, the healer, had armed herself with a short sword, her movements swift and calculated as she fought beside the others. Tetsuo's mind, though focused on the battle at hand, could not help but reflect on the path that had led him here. The Takeda had come for the sword, but they had also come for him, just as they had come for Lord Okamoto years ago. The fall of his lord, the destruction of his house, had shaped his life in ways he could not have imagined. The memories of that day, the blood, the screams, the smell of fire, haunted him still. He had sworn to protect the sword and to avenge his lord, and now, in the midst of battle, those promises were being tested. The Takeda forces pushed forward, but Tetsuo stood firm. He was a samurai, once a protector, now a protector once more. His blade cut through the chaos of the battle, striking down those who came too close, his every movement a reflection of the discipline and honor he had once sworn to uphold. But even as Tetsuo fought with all the skill and ferocity of a seasoned warrior, he could feel the weight of the battle bearing down on him. There were too many of them. The Takeda were relentless, and their warriors were well trained, their tactics honed in countless battles. They would not stop until they had what they wanted. They would not stop until they had the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba. Suddenly, a shout pierced the din of battle. Tetsuo's head snapped to the side, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw Ryuji leading a small group of elite Takeda soldiers, heading straight for him. Ryuji's eyes burned with cold determination, and Tetsuo knew that this man was not just another foot soldier. He was the one who had come for the sword. Tetsuo's hand tightened around the hilt of the sword. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. Ryuji was the one who would stop at nothing to claim the blade, to claim the power it held, and Tetsuo could not allow that to happen. With a grunt of effort, Tetsuo pushed through the throngs of enemies, his blade cutting down anyone who stood in his path. His movements were fluid, each strike a deadly dance, each parry a step closer to Ryuji. The noise of battle faded in the background as he focused solely on his opponent. Ryuji raised his sword, a cruel smile curling on his lips. "You've fought well, Tetsuo, but your time has come. The sword will be mine, just as your life will be." Tetsuo's eyes narrowed. "You will never have it," he spat, his voice low and filled with unyielding resolve. With a roar, Ryuji charged forward, his sword aimed directly at Tetsuo's heart. The two warriors collided with a deafening crash, their blades meeting in a shower of sparks. The force of the impact sent a shockwave through Tetsuo's body, but he withstood it, his feet rooted firmly to the ground. The two men fought with the fury of long-simmering hatred, their swords clashing with a fury that could only come from those who had lived through the fires of war. Tetsuo's movements were a blur, his strikes fast and precise. But Ryuji was no novice. His skill in battle was apparent in the way he blocked each of Tetsuo's strikes, countering with ferocity and precision. For a moment, it seemed as though the battle would come to a standstill. But then, Ryuji's sword came down with a force that pushed Tetsuo back, forcing him to stumble. In that split second, Ryuji took advantage, his sword aimed directly at Tetsuo's chest. But Tetsuo was ready. With a swift motion, he stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding the blow, and countered with a strike that sent Ryuji's sword flying from his hand. Tetsuo's blade caught Ryuji across the chest, the blow leaving a deep gash. Ryuji staggered back, clutching at the wound. Blood dripped from his side, but his eyes burned with a fury that was almost unnatural. "You think this is over, Tetsuo?" he hissed, his voice ragged. "This is just the beginning." Tetsuo stood tall, his breath heavy, his body battered from the fight, but he was unyielding. "It ends here, Ryuji," he said coldly. "The sword will never belong to you." Before Ryuji could react, Tetsuo stepped forward, his blade poised. With a final decisive strike, he ended the fight, severing Ryuji's command over the Takeda forces and putting an end to the threat. The Takeda soldiers who had followed Ryuji hesitated for a moment, fear flickering in their eyes as they realized their leader had fallen. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough. In that instant, Tetsuo's comrades, Yamato, Takeda, and Ayumi, seized the opportunity. They fought with renewed vigor, striking down the remaining Takeda soldiers with deadly precision. The battle raged on, but the tide was turning. The Takeda forces, now leaderless and disorganized, began to falter. Tetsuo, his heart still pounding, in his chest, surveyed the battlefield. His men were holding their ground, their resolve unbroken. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba remained safe for now. But the war was far from over. Tetsuo could feel it in the air. This was not the final battle. The Takeda would return, and the fight for the sword would continue. The echoes of the past, of Lord Okamoto's fall, of the promise Tetsuo had made, rang in his ears. This battle was only one piece of a larger story, a story that had been written long ago and was still unfolding. The sword would not rest easily. In his hands, it never had. And so, with the blood of battle on his hands, Tetsuo turned toward the ruins of his lord's house, the place where it all began, and prepared himself for the challenges that were yet to come. The battle had ended, but the air still vibrated with the echoes of its fury. The silence that followed was unnerving. The moon, now higher in the sky, cast a cold light over the valley, illuminating the scattered bodies of fallen soldiers, both Takeda and those who had stood with Tetsuo. The blood of the dead seeped into the earth, a grim testament to the violence that had transpired. Tetsuo stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving, his breath heavy and labored. His sword was slick with blood, its gleaming surface dulled by the stains of battle. But it was not the sword that weighed most heavily on his mind. It was the cost of the fight. Despite their victory, despite the Takeda's retreat, Tetsuo knew this battle was but a momentary respite. The war for the sword, for the soul of Kagehira, was far from over. Around him, his companions moved methodically, checking the fallen, making sure the Takeda forces were no longer a threat. Yamato, ever the warrior, was already coordinating their next steps, ensuring they had a plan for the coming days. Takeda, the archer, was silently collecting arrows and weapons from the fallen, while Ayumi, her face pale but determined, attended to the wounded. Tetsuo's thoughts, however, kept returning to the battle's central figure, Ryuji. The Takeda agent had been fierce and unyielding, and his final words had not been lost on Tetsuo. This is just the beginning. Tetsuo knew that Ryuji's death would only ignite a firestorm. The Takeda would not let him, or the sword, slip through their fingers so easily. They had already proven that their reach was long and their ambitions unyielding. This war was far from over. He moved through the battlefield, his feet crunching on the broken earth, and approached the place where Ryuji had fallen. The Takeda leader's body lay sprawled on the ground, his armor pierced by Tetsuo's blade, his once impassive face now frozen in an expression of shock and defiance. Tetsuo stood over him for a long moment, his sword still in hand. He could feel the weight of the man's life, of all the lives lost, on his conscience. Every man who had fallen, every woman who had been left behind, every family torn apart by the war. It was all a part of the same tragedy. The sword of Kagehira no Tsuba had never been just a weapon. It had always been a symbol. And now that symbol was stained with blood. The wind howled through the valley, rustling the remnants of the ruined estate. Tetsuo turned his gaze upward toward the broken walls of Lord Okamoto's house. The home where his lord had once stood, strong and unwavering, had been reduced to nothing but rubble. The thought of what had been lost, of the honor, the loyalty, the dreams of a united land, stirred something deep within him. "We can't stay here long," Yamato's voice broke through his reverie. The older man's face was grim as he approached, his armor scratched and bloodied from the battle. "The Takeda will be back soon, and they won't come alone?" Tetsuo nodded slowly. "I know, but we've bought ourselves time. We can't let it go to waste. We need to move," Yamato continued. "We can't afford to fight another battle here, not in these ruins. If we're going to protect the sword, we need to get out of the valley. We need to regroup, find a place where we can plan our next move." Tetsuo didn't answer immediately. His mind was elsewhere, still caught in the memory of the battle, still haunted by the weight of the decisions he had made. But Yamato was right. The Takeda would return, and they would come with greater force. They needed to be prepared. They needed to regroup. "We'll move by dawn," Tetsuo said, his voice steady. "We'll head toward the mountains to the north. There's a hidden pass that can take us into the highlands. It'll give us a vantage point, and it will be harder for the Takeda to track us." Yamato nodded approvingly. "Good. We'll move fast and quietly. We can't afford to leave any tracks." Tetsuo looked around at the rest of his group. Ayumi was tending to a young villager, her brow furrowed in concentration, while Takeda surveyed the fallen with a solemn expression. He saw the same resolve. In their eyes, the same determination to protect Kagehira's legacy. "We will not fail," Tetsuo said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction. "We will honor our fallen, and we will protect the sword." As the group prepared to leave, the ruins of Lord Okamoto's estate seemed to loom over them, casting long shadows in the night. The thought of leaving this place, leaving behind the home of his fallen lord, was difficult for Tetsuo. But he knew it was necessary. The Takeda would not give up easily, and if they stayed here any longer, they would only be walking into a trap. The group gathered their things in silence. Ayumi finished tending to the wounded villager, and Takeda spoke, softly with Yamato, discussing their route. The air was thick with the gravity of the situation. No words were needed. They all understood the stakes. By the time dawn broke, the group was ready to move. The first light of morning pierced through the trees, casting a pale glow over the valley as they set off toward the mountains. The journey was slow and deliberate, their movements cautious as they navigated the treacherous terrain. The forest, dense and quiet, seemed to close in around them, muffling their steps. Tetsuo could feel the weight of the sword at his side, a constant reminder of his duty. But as they moved further from the valley, he allowed himself a moment to think. The Takeda were not just a military force. They were a symbol of everything he had fought against. The rise of these warlords, the corruption of the shogunate, the endless cycle of violence that consumed the land, it was all part of the same problem. And at the center of it all was the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba. It was the key to uniting the fractured nation, or destroying it. The quiet of the forest provided a small sense of peace, but Tetsuo knew it would not last. They were in the shadow of a silent war, a war that had been raging for years, long before he had ever drawn his sword. The Takeda's ambitions were only part of the larger struggle, a struggle that would test not just his strength, but his very ideals. The land was divided, the samurai honor was fading, and the old ways were being lost. But Tetsuo was not ready to give up on them. He could not. Not as long as the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba existed. As the group pressed on, Tetsuo's thoughts turned to the future, to the battles yet to come. The Takeda would pursue them. The warlords would continue to vie for power, and the nation would remain torn. But Tetsuo would not falter. The silent war that had raged in the shadows for so long was now on the verge of breaking into the open. And he, the last Ronin of Kagehira, would be at the heart of it. The forest grew denser as they ventured deeper into the highlands, each step taking them further away from the valley, from the ruins of Lord Okamoto's estate, and closer into the heart of the mountains. The air was thinner here, cooler, and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. The journey had been taxing, but there was a quiet sense of determination within Tetsuo and his companions. They had survived the battle in the valley, but they all knew that their fight was far from over. Every step they took brought them closer to the next battle, the next challenge. The Takeda would not stop. They would not rest until they had reclaimed the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba, but neither would Tetsuo. The promise he had made to Lord Okamoto, to Kagehira, still burned bright within him. He could feel the weight of the sword at his side, constant reminder of that oath. His resolve was unyielding, and he knew that his path was now set. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, but he would walk it without hesitation. As night began to fall, the sky above them turned a deep shade of crimson, the moon rising high and full. The full moon was a rare sight in the highlands, but tonight it appeared more vivid than ever, casting a red glow over the landscape. It was an omen, or so some would say. Tetsuo couldn't help but feel its significance, a reminder of the bloodshed that had stained the land and the blood that would yet be spilled before this war was over. They had camped for the night in a small clearing, surrounded by dense trees. A small fire crackled in the center of their camp, its warmth a welcome respite from the chill of the mountain air. Tetsuo sat on a log, staring into the flames, lost in thought. His mind raced as he considered their next move. The Takeda had already shown their hand, and Tetsuo knew that they would not rest until they had reclaimed the sword. But it was not just the Takeda who sought it. There were other forces at play, other warlords and factions who had their eyes on the prize. Tetsuo's thoughts were interrupted by Yamato, who sat beside him, his voice low and steady. "We've bought ourselves time, but not much. The Takeda will be regrouping, and they won't hesitate to send out more men to find us." Tetsuo nodded. Silently. "I know. We need to stay ahead of them, but we also need allies. We can't face the Takeda alone. We need to find those who are willing to stand with us, those who still remember what it means to fight for honor." Yamato regarded him for a moment before speaking again. "You know, it's strange. The Takeda are powerful, but they're not the only threat. The true danger lies in the ambitions of those who see this sword as the key to power. The Takeda may be the most immediate threat, but there are others, men who would use this sword to conquer all of Japan." Tetsuo's gaze hardened. "I understand. The Takeda want it, but so do the others. Whoever controls the sword controls the future of Japan." Yamato's eyes flickered to the moon, now fully risen, casting its red light over the camp. "The red moon," he said softly, almost to himself. "It's a bad omen, Tetsuo. I've seen it before, many years ago, when the battle for Kagehira began. It was the same moon that rose the night your lord fell." Tetsuo felt a shiver run down his spine. The moon, its crimson light, had always been a symbol of bloodshed, of violence that would change the course of history. It had appeared before the fall of Lord Okamoto's house, and now it had appeared again. The land was on the edge of something terrible, and the sword, the symbol of Okamoto's house, was at the center of it all. "The moon has seen the blood of our ancestors, and it will see more," Tetsuo murmured. "But we will not let it fall into the wrong hands." Yamato nodded. "The sword is a beacon, Tetsuo. Whoever holds it will hold the power to shape the future of this land. But it is a double-edged sword. It can bring peace, or it can destroy everything." Tetsuo's grip tightened on the hilt of the sword at his side. He understood the weight of those words. The sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was not just a weapon. It was a symbol of the old ways, the ways of honor and loyalty. But it was also a tool of immense power, a power that could be wielded for good or for evil. "We cannot let it fall into the wrong hands," Tetsuo said again, his voice cold with resolve. "No matter the cost." Yamato regarded him with a quiet intensity. "You know, Tetsuo, it's not just the Takeda or the warlords who want the sword. There are others, those who remain in the shadows, those who have their own plans for the sword's power. The sword will bring us more enemies than we can count." Tetsuo's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll face them all. We won't let anyone take what belongs to Kagehira." The night wore on, the fire crackling softly as the moon hung high above them. The red moon cast long shadows across the camp, as if watching over them, a silent witness to the war that was brewing. The next morning, Tetsuo and his companions packed up their camp and set off once more into the mountains. They had a long way to go, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But they moved with purpose, their steps steady, their eyes focused on the horizon. They had no illusions about the road ahead. This was only the beginning. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, Tetsuo's thoughts returned to the sword. He had spent his life in service to his lord, and now that service had brought him to this moment. The sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was a symbol of honor, of duty, and of sacrifice. It had the power to unite the fractured land or to destroy it. Tetsuo knew that the path ahead would not be easy. The Takeda were not the only threat. There were other forces at work, unseen and silent, waiting to strike. But he was ready. The sword had chosen him, and he would not falter in his duty to protect it. As they reached the top of a ridge, Tetsuo paused for a moment, looking out over the land below. The sun was rising, casting golden light over the valley. In the distance, he could see the smoke of a distant campfire, a sign of life, of movement. But that was not their concern now. Their concern was the sword and the fate of Kagehira. "The Takeda will follow us," Yamato said, breaking the silence. "But we're not running. We're moving forward." Tetsuo nodded. "We're not running. We're preparing." And with that, the group descended into the valley below, ready for whatever lay ahead. The land was changing, and so was Tetsuo. The sword had become more than just a symbol of his past. It was a beacon, drawing forces from all corners of the land, forces that would either destroy everything he had known or forge a new future. Beneath the red moon, the war had only just begun. The days blurred together as Tetsuo and his companions made their way through the winding paths of the highlands. The sun rose and set, casting long shadows across the landscape, but there was no respite from the weight of the journey. The Takeda were still in pursuit, their relentless march a constant threat. Yet, as they moved deeper into the mountains, Tetsuo couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. It wasn't just the Takeda anymore. It was something more elusive, more dangerous. The world was changing, and as the land shifted, so too did the old power structures. The shogunate, once a mighty force in Japan, had begun to falter, its grip on the country weakening with each passing day. Though the Takeda were one of the most powerful clans in Japan, there were other factions that still lurked in the shadows, clans that were too quiet, too subtle, to be easily detected. As night fell, Tetsuo and his group set camp in a secluded valley near a small stream. The air was cool, and the sky was clear, the stars sharp and brilliant against the black expanse above. Tetsuo stood at the edge of the camp, looking out into the darkened mountains. There was a strange stillness in the air, as if the land itself held its breath, waiting for something. "Something's not right," Tetsuo muttered to himself, his gaze shifting between the trees and the distant ridgelines. Yamato approached him quietly, his face shadowed in the dim light of the campfire. "You feel it too, don't you?" Tetsuo nodded. "It's like we're being hunted, but not just by the Takeda?" Yamato's expression darkened. "There are others, Tetsuo, other powers, forces that have no love for the Takeda or the shogunate, forces that have their own agenda, and they're moving in the shadows." Tetsuo turned to face his companion. "What do you mean? You're not talking about just warlords, are you?" Yamato's voice dropped to a near whisper. "No, I'm talking about the remnants of the shogunate's old guard, the samurai who served them, who still believe that Japan's future lies in the hands of the emperor and the old ways. But they're no longer interested in upholding the emperor's will. They've become something darker, something more dangerous." Tetsuo's heart skipped a beat. "The ghosts of the shogunate," he murmured. Yamato nodded gravely. "Yes, the old samurai, those who have been abandoned by the emperor and forgotten by the world. They're still out there, waiting, watching, plotting. They want power. They want control. And they believe that the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba could be the key to restoring the old order." Tetsuo's hand instinctively rested on the hilt of the sword at his side. The weight of it felt heavier now, more burdensome. He had always known that the sword was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol. And as a symbol, it was sought by those with different motives, each one trying to reshape the future in their own image. But the presence of the shogunate's ghosts, those who had once served the emperor, who had fought in the name of the old ways, was a new and unsettling development. They were not just warriors. They were men of great influence and far-reaching power, men who still held sway over the country's remnants. "We have to be careful," Yamato continued. "These men are not to be underestimated. They're still loyal to the emperor, but not in the way you might think. Their loyalty lies in their vision of Japan, a vision where the sword is the key to power, and they'll stop at nothing to possess it." Tetsuo's thoughts raced. If the Takeda were the immediate threat, then the ghosts of the shogunate represented a far deeper danger. They were hidden, elusive, but their presence in the shadows was growing stronger by the day. They would not be content with merely taking the sword. They wanted control over Japan itself. And to them, the sword was not just a tool. It was a means of power, a key to unlocking a future that no longer belonged to the samurai. "Do you think they've already discovered our movements?" Tetsuo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yamato's eyes darkened. "It's possible. They have eyes everywhere. The Takeda might be the visible threat, but the ghosts of the shogunate are the silent ones. They work from the shadows, pulling strings, gathering support from those who still believe in the old ways." Tetsuo stared into the fire, his mind turning over what Yamato had said. The Takeda, with their open ambition and hunger for power, were a clear and present danger. But the ghosts of the shogunate, these were shadows within shadows, their presence felt in the smallest of whispers, in the flicker of eyes just out of view. They were the true masters of manipulation, working behind the scenes to shape the country's future. If they sought the sword, there was no telling what lengths they would go to in order to claim it. Suddenly, the stillness of the night was broken by a rustling sound in the trees beyond the camp. Tetsuo's hand flew to his sword, his body tense, his senses on high alert. Yamato was already moving toward the edge of the camp, his hand resting on the hilt of his own blade. "Stay alert," Yamato whispered, his voice barely audible. Tetsuo nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound of rustling grew louder, closer. It was not the wind. Someone was moving through the trees. "Did you hear that?" Ayumi's voice came from behind them, her expression concerned. "It's too quiet." Tetsuo's eyes narrowed. "It's them," he murmured. Yamato moved swiftly, drawing his sword and stepping cautiously toward the sound. The others followed, weapons drawn, their movements quiet but purposeful. The rustling grew louder. Then, from the shadows of the trees, figures emerged, cloaked. In black, their faces hidden beneath the hoods of their dark garments. They moved with a fluid grace, like hunters stalking their prey, their eyes glinting with a cold, calculating hunger. Tetsuo's heart raced. These were not Takeda soldiers. They were different, more refined, more disciplined. Their movements were precise, their silence unnerving. "Who are you?" Tetsuo called, his voice steady but firm. The figures stopped, their eyes flickering between Tetsuo and his companions. One of them, a tall man with a sharp, angular face, stepped forward. His voice was smooth, almost soothing, but it held an unmistakable edge. "We are the remnants of the old order," the man said, his words dripping with quiet menace. "We are the ghosts of the shogunate." Tetsuo's blood ran cold. These were the men Yamato had spoken of, the old samurai, the ghosts who had abandoned the emperor's cause, but who still saw themselves as the true rulers of Japan. "We seek the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba," the man continued, his gaze fixed on Tetsuo, "and we will have it, one way or another." Tetsuo's grip tightened on his sword. "You'll have to take it from me?" The man smiled coldly, and Tetsuo could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had been found. The ghosts of the shogunate had come for the sword, and they would stop at nothing to claim it. But Tetsuo would not let them take it, not without a fight. The stage was set. The Takeda were still a looming threat, but now the shadows had deepened. The ghosts of the shogunate had entered the fray, and their presence in the dark corners of the world was a chilling reminder of the power struggles that had been set into motion long before Tetsuo had drawn his sword. The war for Kagehira no Tsuba had only just begun, and the true battle for Japan's soul was about to unfold. The night air was thick with tension, as the ghosts of the shogunate circled around Tetsuo and his companions. The fire flickered erratically, casting long shadows across the camp as the figures stood, unmoving, their eyes never leaving their quarry. They were close now, too close, and Tetsuo could feel the weight of their presence pressing down on him. This was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the very soul of the country, a fight for the future of Japan itself. The man at the forefront of the ghosts was tall, his features sharp and angular, his dark eyes cold and calculating. He wore the tattered remnants of samurai armor, the once proud insignia of the shogunate now faded and worn. His presence was commanding, his gaze fixed firmly on Tetsuo, as though he could see right through him. "I am Kuroda," the man said, his voice smooth, but filled with a quiet menace. "We are the remnants of the true samurai. The emperor has abandoned us, but we remain loyal to the old ways. We seek the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba to restore the balance, to return Japan to its rightful rulers." Tetsuo's heart pounded in his chest. These men, these ghosts, were no mere wanderers or bandits. They were the old guard of the samurai, men who still clung to the ideals of a lost age, an age that had long since passed. But their vision was dangerous, for they saw the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba as the key to restoring the old order, a vision that would plunge the land into further bloodshed. Tetsuo's hand tightened around the hilt of the sword at his side. He had made a promise in blood, to protect the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba, and he would not break it, not for these men, not for anyone. "You seek the sword," Tetsuo said, his voice cold with resolve, "but you will not have it, not without a fight." Kuroda's lips curled into a thin smile. "We do not seek a fight, Tetsuo. We seek to restore honor to the land, to return Japan to its rightful rulers. The sword of Kagehira no Tsuba is the symbol of that restoration." "You are mistaken," Tetsuo said, his eyes narrowing. "The sword is not a symbol for your cause. It is a weapon, one that can either unite or destroy this land. I will not allow it to fall into your hands." Kuroda's gaze hardened. "You misunderstand. The sword belongs to us, to those who understand the true meaning of honor and duty. You, a mere Ronin, are not worthy of wielding such power." Tetsuo's hand never left the sword. "I swore an oath to protect this sword and its legacy," he said, his voice unwavering. "I will die before I let it fall into the wrong hands." The tension in the air was palpable as the two men stood face to face, the weight of their words hanging between them like a storm ready to break. The ghosts of the shogunate remained motionless, their eyes fixed on the scene, waiting for the zhongni. First sign of movement. Tetsuo could feel the eyes of his companions on him, each of them waiting for his next move. The wind howled through the trees, breaking the silence, and Tetsuo knew that time was running out. The ghosts would not back down. They would not leave without the sword. "We've given you a choice," Kuroda said, his voice low and dangerous. "Now you will make a decision. Hand over the sword, and we will allow you to live. Refuse, and we will take it by force." Tetsuo's mind raced. He had no illusions about what was at stake. The ghosts of the shogunate were not just warriors. They were men who believed that their cause was righteous. They would stop at nothing to reclaim the sword, to use its power to restore the old order. To them, the future of Japan depended on it. But Tetsuo could not allow that to happen. The sword was not meant to be a tool for warlords or conquerors. It was a symbol of something more, something greater than any one man's vision of power. "You will not have it," Tetsuo said, his voice filled with quiet determination. At his side, Yamato stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his own sword. "We stand with Tetsuo," he said, his voice strong. If you want the sword, you'll have to take it from all of us. Takeda, the archer, stood next to him, bow in hand, his eyes sharp and ready. Ayumi, the healer, had already drawn her blade, her face set in grim resolve. Tetsuo could feel their loyalty, their readiness to fight, and in that moment, he knew they would stand by him, no matter the cost. Kuroda's smile faded, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. Very. Well, he said, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. You have made your choice. The air seemed to crackle with tension as the ghosts of the shogunate slowly drew their blades, their movements fluid and practiced. The night was still, save for the sound of steel scraping against metal. Tetsuo's eyes flickered to his companions. They were ready. Together, they would face whatever came next. The first move came from Kuroda. With a swift motion, he drew his blade and lunged forward, his sword flashing in the firelight. Tetsuo was ready. He stepped to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike, and countered with a powerful slash that forced Kuroda to step back. The sound of metal on metal rang out as their swords met, sparks flying. The battle had begun. The ghosts of the shogunate moved with deadly precision, their blades flashing in the moonlight as they attacked with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. Tetsuo fought with the strength of his conviction, each strike a reflection of his unyielding will to protect the sword. His movements were fluid and precise, his sword cutting through the air with the grace of a master. Yamato fought at his side, his broad sword sweeping through the enemies with ruthless efficiency. Takeda's arrows flew through the air, each shot finding its mark with deadly accuracy. Ayumi moved with swift grace, her short sword flashing as she fought to protect her. Comrades, but the ghosts of the shogunate were no ordinary foes. They were skilled, disciplined, and relentless, each one fighting with the skill of a master. The battle raged on, a brutal clash of steel and will, as Tetsuo and his companions fought to hold their ground. Kuroda, his eyes filled with cold determination, continued to press forward, his blade a blur of deadly precision. Tetsuo parried his strikes, his own sword dancing in his hands. The two men were locked in a deadly struggle, their swords clashing with a force that shook the ground beneath them. With each passing moment, the battle grew fiercer. The ghosts of the shogunate fought with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose, and Tetsuo and his companions were pushed to their limits. Sweat poured from their brows, and their bodies ached with the effort of the fight. But they would not relent. They would not give in. Tetsuo's blade clashed with Kuroda's once more, the impact sending a shockwave through his body. He staggered, but quickly regained his footing, his eyes flashing with resolve. "This ends now," Tetsuo growled, his voice filled with unwavering determination. With one final decisive strike, Tetsuo moved with lightning speed, his blade slicing through the air and meeting Kuroda's in a powerful clash. The force of the blow sent Kuroda sprawling to the ground, his sword falling from his hand. For a moment, the world seemed to freeze, and then, with a final swift motion, Tetsuo ended the battle. Kuroda lay still on the ground, his eyes closed, the life drained from his body. The remaining ghosts of the shogunate hesitated, their eyes flickering between Tetsuo and their fallen leader. Tetsuo's gaze never left them. He could feel their uncertainty, their fear. The fight was over. "We are the ones who decide the future of this land," Tetsuo said, his voice low and filled with authority. "The sword will not fall into the hands of those who would use it to destroy." The remaining ghosts of the shogunate slowly lowered, their swords, their eyes filled with reluctant respect. They knew they had been defeated, but Tetsuo knew this was only the beginning. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The Takeda would not rest. The ghosts of the shogunate would regroup, and there were still others, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their chance. But for now, Tetsuo had kept his promise. The sword was safe for now. The air was thick with the aftermath of battle, and the valley that had been the site of the ghosts of the shogunate's assault now lay eerily quiet. The tension that had filled the night seemed to have dissipated, replaced by the quiet rustling of leaves and the gentle wind. The camp was still, save for the occasional flicker of the fire and the distant cry of an owl. It was as if the world itself was trying to recover from the violence that had unfolded. Tetsuo stood at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the horizon. His grip on the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was still firm, as though he couldn't bear to let it out of his grasp. The weight of it, now more symbolic than ever, weighed heavily on him. Despite the victory, the battle had come at a cost. Kuroda, the leader of the ghosts of the shogunate, had fallen, but the cost of that victory, of their survival, was more than just bloodshed. It was a reminder that their journey was far from over, that the forces of ambition were growing ever stronger, and that the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba would continue to draw enemies, both old and new. Yamato approached, his expression solemn but determined. His armor was scratched and bloodied, and there was a deep gash on his arm, though he seemed unfazed by it. "Tetsuo," Yamato began, his voice steady, "we've won a battle, but the war is far from over. The Takeda will come for us, and the remnants of the shogunate won't rest either. There's something else, though. Something I've been meaning to tell you." Tetsuo turned to face him, his brow furrowing. "What is it?" Yamato hesitated, his eyes darkening. "We've been betrayed." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tetsuo's heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening on his sword. Betrayed? By whom? Yamato met his gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and anger. "Ayumi. She's not who we thought she was." Tetsuo's mind reeled as the realization sank in. Ayumi, the healer, the one who had tended to their wounds and fought by their side with unwavering dedication. She had been a trusted ally, someone Tetsuo had come to rely on. But now, the words Yamato spoke shattered everything. "She's been in contact with the Takeda. She's been feeding them information about our movements," Yamato continued, his voice low. "I found a letter, written in her hand, hidden in one of our packs. It's from a Takeda officer, telling her to report on the sword's whereabouts." Tetsuo's stomach churned with disbelief. Ayumi? A traitor? It didn't make sense. She had always been so kind, so selfless, healing the wounded and standing alongside them as an equal. How could she betray them? How could she betray him? "Are you sure?" Tetsuo asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yamato nodded grimly. "I'm sure. She's been playing both sides, acting like one of us while secretly working for the Takeda. She's the reason they've been able to track us. She's been feeding them information about our location, about the sword." Tetsuo's mind raced as the weight of the revelation settled over him. His first instinct was to confront Ayumi, to demand answers, but there was a sense of cold finality in Yamato's words. She had betrayed them, and the consequences of that betrayal were far-reaching. As if on cue, Ayumi emerged from the shadows of the trees, her face pale, her eyes flickering nervously as she approached the campfire. She seemed unaware of the tension that hung in the air, her usual calm demeanor shattered by the weight of the moment. "Tetsuo, Yamato," she said softly, her voice shaking, I know I owe you both an explanation." Tetsuo stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Explain?" he said, his voice laced with cold fury. "You've been working with the Takeda, feeding them information about us. You've been a traitor from the start." Ayumi recoiled, her eyes widening with a flash of panic. "No, Tetsuo. It's not what you think. Please, listen to me." But Tetsuo could hear the tremor in her voice, and his mind was made up. The trust he had placed in her, the bond they had shared, was now shattered, and it felt like a wound that cut deeper than any sword. "You've put all of us in danger," Yamato said, his tone harsh. "You've been deceiving us all along." Ayumi's face paled even further, and her hand reached up to clutch her chest. "I didn't want to. I never wanted to betray you. I thought I could make a difference. I thought I could protect the sword from falling into the hands of the Takeda. But..." She paused, her voice faltering. "But I was offered something. Something that I couldn't refuse." Tetsuo's mind raced. "What could they have offered you to make you betray us?" he demanded. "What is it?" Ayumi's eyes filled with tears. "The Takeda promised me power," she whispered. "Power to heal, power to save. They promised me that I could protect the people of this land, that I could use the sword to stop the wars. They promised that I could save those I care about, including you, Tetsuo." Tetsuo's breath caught in his throat. "Save me?" he repeated, his voice hollow. "By betraying me?" Ayumi nodded, her expression pleading. "I never wanted to betray you, Tetsuo. But the Takeda are powerful. They know the value of the sword, and they know that I know how to get to it. I thought I could use their offer to bring an end to the bloodshed, to stop this war." Tetsuo stared at her, his mind torn. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that she had acted out of some misguided sense of loyalty, that she wasn't truly a traitor, but the evidence was undeniable. Her actions had put them all in jeopardy. "You've made your choice," Tetsuo said coldly, "and now we must make ours." Yamato stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his sword. "We can't allow you to continue this. You've put us all at risk." Ayumi's eyes flickered between them, desperation evident in her gaze. "Please, Tetsuo. Please, Yamato. Let me explain." "There's still time." "The Takeda." "There is no more time," Tetsuo interrupted, his voice sharp. "The Takeda will stop at nothing to get the sword, and you've already told them where it is. We cannot trust you anymore, Ayumi." The healer's face crumpled in sorrow, but there was no turning back. The weight of her betrayal was too great to ignore, and the consequences of her actions were too severe. Her presence among them was a danger that could no longer be allowed to fester. Tetsuo turned away from her, his face hardening with resolve. "Take her away from the camp," he said, his voice quiet but final. "She's no longer welcome here." Yamato moved without hesitation, his hand grabbing Ayumi's arm and leading her away from the camp. Tetsuo didn't watch them go. He couldn't. Instead, he turned his gaze to the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba, its gleaming surface reflecting the firelight. It was the one thing that still held the key to everything. It was the symbol of what they had fought for, their honor, their duty, their survival. But it was also the reason for all the bloodshed. And now, it seemed like the sword had become a curse, a reminder of the betrayal that was eating away at their very souls. The fire crackled and popped in the stillness of the night, the distant sounds of the mountains echoing around them. Tetsuo's companions had been shaken by the betrayal, and the trust that had once bound them together now lay in tatters. Ayumi's actions had changed everything. They had lost not just a trusted ally, but a piece of their humanity. And in the shadows of the betrayal, something darker was taking root. The Takeda were still coming. The ghosts of the shogunate were still lurking. And now, even within their own ranks, there were whispers of betrayal. As Tetsuo stared into the flames, the weight of the sword at his side felt heavier than ever before. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with more dangers than he could count. But he knew one thing for sure. The time for trusting others was over. The fight for the sword was far from finished. And this battle would be fought not just on the battlefield, but within the hearts of those who sought it. The journey that had begun with a promise to protect Kagehira no Tsuba now felt like an endless nightmare. The sword, once a symbol of honor and legacy, had become a magnet for bloodshed, a weapon coveted by all the wrong people. Tetsuo could feel its weight at his side, but now it was not just the weight of the steel. It was the weight of the choices he had made, of the people he had trusted, and of the terrible burden of protecting something that could unravel everything. He held dear. Ayumi's betrayal had cut deeper than he had expected, not because of the danger she had put them in, though that was undeniable, but because she had been someone he had considered a friend. She had healed their wounds, fought beside them, shared their victories and losses. To find out that she had been a double agent, that her kindness had been a mask for her loyalty to the Takeda, it was a wound that would take time to heal, if it ever could. But they couldn't afford to dwell on the past. The Takeda were still a threat. The ghosts of the shogunate were still lurking in the shadows, and the sword remained the key to everything. It wasn't just the Takeda who sought it anymore. The sword had become a symbol, a beacon that had drawn the attention of more powerful forces. And now, Tetsuo had a new looming threat to deal with: the imperial court. The journey through the mountains had brought them to a small village where they were able to rest, though only for a brief time. The village was quiet, isolated, almost too quiet. The people here had little to offer but basic hospitality, but they had been kind enough to allow Tetsuo and his companions to stay the night. The stillness was an uncomfortable one. Tetsuo couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He hadn't told his companions yet, but there was a subtle shift in the air, something darker, something that made his skin prickle. The Takeda, though a threat in their own right, were not the only players in this game. The remnants of the shogunate had made their move, but it was the imperial court, or rather the men behind it, who had the true power. And they had been silent, too silent. Yamato, ever watchful, seemed to sense it too. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he pulled Tetsuo aside, away from the firelight, his voice a low murmur. "There are whispers in the wind, Tetsuo. The imperial court is moving, but not in the way we expected." Tetsuo raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I've been hearing things. Rumors from travelers passing through the village," Yamato continued, his voice tense. "There's been word of imperial agents, men sent by the court, tracking the movements of the Takeda. But they're not just following them. They're looking for the sword." Tetsuo's heart skipped a beat. The sword, it seemed, was no longer just a tool of war. It was a piece of a much larger game, a game that was being played at the highest levels of power. The imperial court was no longer just a symbol of authority. It had become an instrument of control, a shadow that had begun to reach into the darkest corners of the country. Why would the court be interested in the sword? Tetsuo asked, his mind racing. Yamato's eyes flickered to the small fire behind them, the flames dancing in the night's breeze. "The court is fractured, Tetsuo. The emperor is a figurehead. He has no real power anymore. But those who serve him, the men behind the throne, they have their own ambitions. And the sword, Kagehira no Tsuba, is more than just a weapon. It's a symbol, a key to the old ways. Whoever controls the sword controls more than just land or power. They control the loyalty of the people, the heart of Japan itself." Tetsuo frowned, a dark thought crossing his mind. "You think they want the sword to restore the old order?" Yamato nodded grimly. "Exactly. The men behind the emperor don't want peace. They want to control Japan's future. They want to recreate the samurai rule, but under their own terms. The Takeda might be an immediate threat, but the true danger lies with the men who hide behind the imperial court. If they find the sword, they will not stop until it is in their hands. And with it, they will plunge Japan into another war." Tetsuo clenched his jaw, the weight of Yamato's words sinking in. The Takeda, the ghosts of the shogunate, these were tangible threats, but the court? The very institution that should have been a beacon of unity had become a puppet master pulling the strings from behind the curtain. "We need to move," Tetsuo said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We cannot let the sword fall into their hands." Yamato nodded, his face set with grim determination. "We've been playing defense long enough. It's time to take the fight to them." Tetsuo turned to head back to the camp, his mind focused, the weight of his decision settling over him. They could no longer hide in the mountains. They had to face the truth. They would have to take the sword to the heart of the court itself. The next day, they set out once again, the shadows of the mountains now behind them. The village they had passed through had been a brief respite, but now they moved with purpose. The Takeda were still pursuing them, but they were no longer the primary concern. The court, with all its intrigue and power, had now taken center, stage in their battle for the sword. The road ahead was fraught with danger. Tetsuo knew that the Imperial agents would be watching, waiting. They would be looking for any sign of the sword's presence, and when they found it, they would stop at nothing to claim it. As the group made its way south, toward the heart of Japan, Tetsuo couldn't shake the feeling that the Imperial court was not just a symbol of power. It was a ghost that haunted the land, a shadow that stretched across every corner of the country, manipulating events from behind the scenes. The Emperor himself had no true authority, but those who served him in the shadows, those who had their own ambitions, were the ones Tetsuo needed to fear. They would stop at nothing to possess the sword. And once they did, Japan would change. Forever. The journey was long, and with every mile they covered, the sense of being hunted grew stronger. Every small village they passed through, every traveler they encountered, seemed to have eyes that watched them, questions that lingered just beneath the surface. Tetsuo's thoughts turned inward. The world was shifting. The old ways were fading, and the land was caught between the ambition of the warlords, the shadowy intrigues of the court, and the fragile remnants of his samurai code. The sword had been meant to protect Kagehira, but now it had become something else, something more dangerous, more powerful. And Tetsuo was its reluctant guardian. As they approached a crossroads in the road, Yamato stopped suddenly, his eyes narrowing. "There's something wrong," he said, his voice low. Tetsuo's instincts kicked in, and he immediately surveyed the area. The crossroads was quiet, too quiet. No merchants passed by, no travelers stopped for rest. The only sounds were the distant birds and the wind brushing against the trees. Then the faintest whisper of movement, a rustle in the bushes, the soft creak of wood. "We're not alone," Yamato whispered. Tetsuo's hand instinctively moved to his sword, but before he could unsheath it, a group of men emerged from the trees. Their faces were hidden beneath hoods, their movements deliberate and precise. Imperial agents. "We've been expecting you," one of the men said, his voice clipped and cold. He stepped forward, revealing the insignia of the Imperial court. Tetsuo's heart raced. The court had found them. The cold winds of the highlands carried an eerie stillness as Tetsuo stood at the crossroads, his eyes locked on the men who had emerged from the trees. The figures were clad in dark robes, their faces hidden beneath hoods, but there was no mistaking the insignia they wore, the crest of the Imperial court. Tetsuo's stomach tightened. He had feared this moment, and now it was upon them. The Imperial agents were here, and with them came the shadow of the Emperor's power. Tetsuo could feel the weight of their presence, the suffocating realization that the court was no longer just an observer. It was a player in this deadly game. "We've been expecting you," the lead agent said, his voice low and deliberate. The words rang in Tetsuo's ears like a death knell. The sword must be returned to its rightful owners. "The Emperor has spoken." Tetsuo's hand tightened around. The hilt of Kagehira no Tsuba. The agent's words were a threat, a demand wrapped in the cold authority of the imperial court. But Tetsuo would not bend. Not now, not ever. "I will not give it to you," he replied, his voice steady but filled with unyielding resolve. "The sword is not for you, nor for your emperor." The agent's lips curled into a thin smile, as if Tetsuo's defiance only amused him. "The emperor's will cannot be denied, Tetsuo. You have no idea what you are standing against. The sword you hold is more than just a weapon. It is the key to the future of this land." Tetsuo's gaze sharpened. "The sword is not your tool. It is a symbol of the past, and I will protect it from anyone who seeks to misuse it." The agent's smile faded, replaced by cold malice. "You misunderstand? It is not for you to decide the future of Japan. The court has already made its decision." Before Tetsuo could respond, the air grew thick with an unnatural chill. It was as if the very ground beneath them had shifted, and something ancient had awoken. The imperial agents stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on Tetsuo with unsettling intensity. And then, from behind them, a figure stepped forward. A woman draped in dark, tattered robes, her face obscured by a veil of black lace. Tetsuo's breath caught in his throat as the woman's eyes met his. They were unnaturally pale, almost ghostly, and they seemed to gleam with a supernatural knowing. Her presence was not just threatening. It was suffused with an ancient malevolent energy. "This is no longer just about the sword," the woman's voice whispered, her words carrying an unsettling weight. "This is about fate itself." Tetsuo's hand moved instinctively toward his sword, but the woman's gaze held him frozen, in place. Her presence was magnetic, her very aura pushing against him, as though she were a force beyond the mortal realm. The agent beside her spoke again, his voice dripping with disdain. "This is Lady Kori," he said, bowing slightly. "She is a sorceress, a witch of the old ways, and she has been sent by the court to ensure that you do not stand in the way of our destiny." Tetsuo's heart raced. A witch. The ancient arts, long since buried by the wars and the fall of the samurai, had resurfaced with the rise of the imperial court. And this woman, Lady Kori, was a practitioner of those dark, forgotten powers. "Fate cannot be bent," Tetsuo said, his voice strained as he fought to maintain his composure. "You cannot control what is meant to be." Lady Kori's lips parted in a cruel smile. "You have no idea, Tetsuo. The sword is not just a weapon. It is the key to the destiny of all Japan. It must be claimed for the good of the nation." Tetsuo could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. The court had long since abandoned its duty to the people, using the sword and the shogunate's power as tools to control and manipulate. But now, they were not just after the sword. They were after something far darker. "We have seen the future, Tetsuo," Lady Kori whispered, her voice a soft caress that chilled him to the bone. "The sword will bring peace, yes, but not in the way you think. It will bring an end to the chaos, to the bloodshed. It will unite Japan under a new order, an order that will be controlled by the court and its true masters." Tetsuo shook his head, disbelief creeping into his thoughts. This was not the future he had sworn to protect. The sword was never meant to be a tool for oppression or manipulation. It was a symbol of honor and protection, not of power that could be wielded by those who saw it as nothing more than a means to an end. "The future does not belong to the court," Tetsuo said firmly. "It belongs to the people, and I will protect the sword, not for any emperor, not for any warlord, but for the land itself." Lady Kori's smile widened, though it was far from comforting. "The land is only a tool in the hands of the powerful Tetsuo. It always has been." In a swift motion, she raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to ripple, as if the fabric of reality itself had been stretched. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and Tetsuo felt a surge of energy that pushed him backward, forcing him to his knees. The wind howled, and the trees around them creaked as if they were alive, their roots clawing at the earth. Tetsuo struggled to rise, but the pressure was unbearable. He could feel his strength draining, the very life force being siphoned from him as Lady Cori's dark magic took hold. "You will fall in line," she whispered, her voice like a snake's hiss. "You will give the sword to the court, or you will perish." Tetsuo's vision blurred, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. His mind raced, but his body refused to obey. The witch's power was too great. He could feel it wrapping around him like chains, holding him in place. Suddenly, a cry broke through the oppressive atmosphere, piercing the silence like a blade. Yamato charged forward, his broadsword raised high, a roar of defiance in his voice. "Release him," Yamato shouted, his blade cutting through the air with terrifying force. "He is the guardian of the sword, and you will not claim it." The shockwave of Yamato's strike disrupted Lady Cori's concentration, and for a moment, the dark energy faltered. Tetsuo gasped for breath, his strength slowly returning as the pressure lifted. But Lady Cori's eyes blazed with fury. "You think you can stop me?" she hissed, her fingers curling like claws. "You are nothing but pawns in a game you cannot understand." With a wave of her hand, the air crackled with raw power. A gust of wind howled around them, sending dirt and debris flying. Tetsuo's vision wavered as he staggered to his feet, but Yamato was already at his side, his sword held high, ready to defend him. The battle was not yet won. Lady Cori's magic was formidable, but Tetsuo and his companions had something she did not: resolve and the strength of their bond. They were not alone in this fight, and though the court's agents were powerful, they had underestimated one thing: the will of the Last Ronin, who had sworn to protect Kagehira no Tsuba, no matter the cost. Tetsuo's grip tightened on his sword. The time for hesitation was over. The battle was far from finished. But the sword of Kagehira no Tsuba would not fall into the hands of those who would use it for their own twisted agenda. The air crackled with the tension of imminent conflict, the power of Lady Cori's dark magic still lingering in the air like a choking fog. The wind howled around them, carrying with it the faintest whisper of ancient power, as if the earth itself was alive and restless. Tetsuo stood firm, his feet planted in the soil of this sacred land, as his hand tightened around the hilt of Kagehira no Tsuba. This was no longer just a battle for the sword. It was a battle for the very soul of Japan. Yamato stood beside him, his broadsword raised high, eyes filled with unwavering determination. Takeda, ever vigilant, had already notched an arrow too, his bow, his gaze sharp, ready to pick off any foes who dared to approach. Ayumi, despite the betrayal of her earlier actions, stood resolute, her presence still a reminder of the cost of loyalty and the price of redemption. "We can't let her win," Tetsuo murmured, his voice low but steady. "The sword cannot fall into the hands of the imperial court." Yamato nodded, his jaw clenched. "We'll make sure of it, no matter what it takes." Lady Cori's presence seemed to grow even stronger in the face of their defiance. She was a force to be reckoned with, her dark energy swirling around her like a storm waiting to break. Her eyes gleamed with the coldness of a woman who had sacrificed everything for her vision of power, for the restoration of the courts. Rule. In her mind, this was not just a fight. It was a reckoning, a chance to rewrite history. "You are all fools," Lady Cori said, her voice smooth but laced with an edge of malice. "You think you can stop what has already been set in motion? The Emperor will be the one to rule. The sword will be his, and Japan will be united under his banner. You cannot change the tide of history." Tetsuo's gaze never wavered as he met her eyes, History is not written by those who seek to control it. It is written by those who fight for what is right. The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba is not a tool for rulers. It is a symbol of honor, and I will not let you use it to destroy that. Honor. Corey's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold contempt. Then you will die for your foolishness, she spat. With a swift, fluid motion, she raised her hands, and the air around them seemed to warp, the ground trembling beneath their feet. A black mist billowed from her fingertips, swirling toward them like a snake seeking its prey. Tetsuo could feel the dark magic gathering, pulling at his strength, his very soul. The power of the old ways, long thought lost, was now fully awakened, and Lady Corey was its master. But Tetsuo would not yield. He could feel the weight of the sword in his hand, its power resonating with his every breath. This was not just a battle of strength. It was a battle of wills, a test of honor. And he would fight with everything he had. Hold fast, Yamato shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We will not falter. Stand your ground. Tetsuo stepped forward, his sword raised high, and in that moment, he felt something shift. It wasn't just the sword, it was the bond that tied him. To his comrades, to the land, to the memory of Lord Okamoto. It was the unwavering resolve that had carried him this far. The belief that the sword was not just a weapon, but a symbol of everything that had been lost, everything that could still be saved. With a mighty roar, Tetsuo charged toward Lady Corey, his blade cutting through the dark mist that surrounded her. The force of his strike sent a shockwave through the air, a powerful reminder that the will of one man standing firm in his beliefs could challenge even the most formidable of powers. Corey's eyes flared with anger as she parried his strike, her magic flaring to life, trying to push him back. But Tetsuo was relentless. He pressed forward, each strike fueled by the strength of his convictions, by the memory of the fallen, and by the weight of the sword in his hand. Behind him, Yamato and the others fought with equal determination. Takeda's arrows flew through the air, striking with deadly accuracy, while Ayumi, her sword gleaming in the moonlight, fought valiantly beside them, despite her own inner turmoil. They were a united front, bound by loyalty and honor, standing against the darkness that threatened to engulf them. But Lady Corey was no ordinary adversary. She summoned the forces of the old world, her magic wrapping around them like chains, seeking to bind their movements. The ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the trees groaning as if they too were caught in the grip of her power. Tetsuo's heart raced as the weight of her magic pressed down on him, but his resolve did not waver. He had made a promise to protect the sword, and he would honor that promise with his life. Your strength is nothing, Corey cried, her voice rising in fury. The sword belongs to the Emperor, and I will see it returned to him, no matter the cost. With a final defiant cry, Tetsuo launched himself at her, his sword gleaming with the intensity of his resolve. In that moment, he knew there was no turning back. This was the battle that would determine not just the fate of the sword, but the fate of Japan itself. The clash was deafening, the sound of metal meeting metal, of magic meeting steel. Tetsuo and Lady Corey fought with everything they had, their movements a blur of speed and power. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble with the force of their blows, the very earth shaking as the battle raged on. But Tetsuo was driven by something greater than mere physical strength. He was driven by his conviction, by the belief that the sword was a symbol of something far more important than any ruler's ambition. It was a symbol of honor, of duty, of sacrifice, and it would not be wielded by those who sought to control it for their own selfish desires. In one final, sweeping motion, Tetsuo launched himself at Lady Corey, his sword cutting through the dark mist that surrounded her. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stopped. And then, with a mighty crash, their swords collided, the force of the blow sending a shockwave through the air. Lady Kori staggered backward, her magic faltering for the briefest of beefy moments, and that was all Tetsuo needed. With a final decisive strike, Tetsuo cut through the air, his blade finding its mark. The force of the blow shattered Kori's defenses, and with a final cry, she crumpled to the ground, her dark magic dissipating into the air like smoke. For a moment, there was silence. The wind stilled, the trees stopped groaning, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Tetsuo stood over her, his sword gleaming in the moonlight, his chest heaving with exertion. His body ached, his mind was weary, but there was a sense of triumph, of finality. The battle was over, for now. But even as Tetsuo stood victorious, he knew the war was not yet won. Lady Kori had been powerful, but she was only a single player in the larger game. The Takeda would still come, the remnants of the shogunate still moved in the shadows, and the imperial court was far from defeated. But for the moment, they had won. The sword was safe. For now, Tetsuo turned to his companions, their faces weary but filled with quiet pride. They had fought together, and together, they had overcome the darkness that had sought to destroy them. "We've won," Tetsuo said, his voice steady, though the weight of the journey was still heavy upon him. "But the war is not over," Yamato replied, his gaze far off, focused on the path ahead. "The sword may be safe for now, but the forces that seek it will only grow stronger. We must stay vigilant." Tetsuo nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of the sword. "We will." The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting an eerie glow over the battlefield. The echoes of battle were still fresh in Tetsuo's ears, but the victory they had won over Lady Kori and her dark magic seemed fleeting. The land, still, reverberating with the weight of the struggle, was silent now, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the night wind. They had beaten Lady Kori, but it had been a hard-fought battle. Her magic had been formidable, and the forces she wielded were unlike any Tetsuo had encountered before. Yet, as he stood over her fallen form, his sword still gleaming with the faint traces of her dark power, he couldn't shake the feeling that this victory was but a brief reprieve. There was more at stake than just the sword now. The land had been poisoned by ambition, by men and women who would stop at nothing to use it as a means to control the future. Tetsuo looked over at his companions. Yamato stood beside him, his face grim, though his eyes were filled with a quiet respect. Takeda had already begun to check the perimeter, ensuring there were no lingering threats. Ayumi, despite the betrayal she had committed, had remained with them throughout the battle, her sword still in hand, her expression filled with quiet remorse and determination. "We cannot stop now," Tetsuo said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "The sword's power is too great. It cannot fall into the hands of the Takeda or the court, not while there are those who would use it to destroy everything we fought for." Yamato nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. "The Takeda will come. We've seen their persistence. But it's not just them. There are other forces in play, and they're all after the same thing. They think that by controlling the sword, they can control the future of Japan." Tetsuo's hand tightened around the hilt of Kagehira no Tsuba. It was a weight that had never been heavier. The sword was no longer just an object of power. It was a symbol, one that had the potential to shift the very balance of Japan. And in the wrong hands, it could unravel everything. Ayumi approached quietly, her footsteps tentative. Despite the tension between them, Tetsuo could see the sincerity in her eyes. She had paid the price for her betrayal, but she had also proven her loyalty through her actions in the battle. She had fought by their side when it counted most. "Tetsuo," she began, her voice low but firm, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness. But I want you to know, I never meant to betray you. I never meant for things to go this far." Tetsuo turned to her, his expression unreadable. He had been through so much over the course of this journey, and yet, standing before him now, Ayumi seemed like a stranger. The betrayal still cut deep, but he could see the regret in her eyes. She had fought with them. After all, even when the odds were against her, she was the woman who had once healed their wounds, who had shared their victories and their losses. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Ayumi continued, her voice shaking slightly. "But I can promise you, I will do whatever it takes to help you protect the sword. I know now that it's not about power or control. It's about protecting the legacy, about honoring the sacrifices made for it." Tetsuo's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a guarded wariness in his eyes. He had made a promise to himself, and to the memory of Lord Okamoto, that he would protect the sword. But trust, once broken, was not easily mended. "We'll need your help," Tetsuo said, his voice steady but tinged with a quiet resolve. "But this is not just about the sword anymore. It's about the people we protect, the lives we save. We cannot allow the world to fall into chaos. If we do, then we're no better than the ones who seek to control us." Ayumi nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "I will fight by your side. I swear it." Tetsuo turned back toward the campfire, his eyes scanning the flickering flames. The night was heavy with the weight of their decisions, and he could feel the invisible threads of fate drawing them all toward an uncertain future. The battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The journey from that point onward was one of quiet determination. They could not afford to rest for long. They had barely survived the assault from the ghosts of the shogunate, and now, Lady Kori had shown them the true depths of the imperial court's ambitions. The sword was not just a weapon to be used in war. It was a symbol, a key to the future of Japan. And the future was a fragile thing, held in the balance. As they traveled south toward the heart of the empire, the sense of being hunted only grew. Every shadow in the forest, every whisper of wind, seemed to carry with it the promise of danger. They knew they were being followed. The Takeda were relentless. The imperial agents, though they had struck from the shadows, would not rest until they had claimed the sword. The ghosts of the shogunate were still out there, waiting to strike when the time was right. The stakes were higher than ever. The journey led them through forests and over mountains, the landscape shifting as they ventured closer to the heart of Japan. The path was difficult, and they moved with caution, never staying in one place for too long. The Takeda's agents were everywhere, as were the spies of the imperial court. They had no allies here, only the sword and their resolve. Along the way, Tetsuo's thoughts often drifted back to the first time he had drawn the sword. He had been a young man then, full of fire and ambition, eager to serve his lord, Lord Okamoto. But now, as he journeyed through this fractured land, he realized how much he had changed. The idealism that had once driven him seemed so far away now, replaced by a grim understanding of the world. The sword, once a tool of honor and protection, had become a symbol of the very things that had corrupted Japan: the thirst for power, the endless struggle for control. It was no longer just a weapon. It was a legacy, one that he would either protect or see destroyed. It was on the edge of a small town, nestled in a secluded valley, that Tetsuo felt the most palpable presence of danger. The village was quiet, the air thick with tension. It was not the Takeda who were waiting for them here, nor the imperial agents, but something far darker, something that had been hidden in the shadows for too long. As the group entered the village, they were greeted by an unexpected sight. Large procession of monks, their robes swaying in the wind, their chants filling the air. There was something unsettling about the gathering, an unnatural calm that seemed to hang in the air. Tetsuo's eyes narrowed as he scanned the monks. They were not like the monks he had known in his travels. These men wore masks, their faces hidden from view. Their movements were deliberate, and their chants were laced with an eerie resonance that sent a chill down his spine. "They're not just monks," Yamato muttered, his voice barely audible. "This is something else." Tetsuo's hand went instinctively to the hilt of his sword. The feeling of being surrounded by unseen enemies, the feeling that they were walking into a trap, was impossible to shake. Ayumi stepped forward, her voice barely a whisper. "The Lotus Sect. I've heard rumors of them. Monks who serve the court. In secret, they believe in the restoration of the old order, and they wield power, dark power." The air seemed to grow heavier as the monks turned their attention toward them. In the midst of the chanting, Tetsuo felt the distinct presence of something ancient, something that had been waiting for them in the darkness. The Lotus Sect was no ordinary religious order. They were the hidden hand of the imperial court, the ones who worked in the shadows, manipulating events for their own ends. Tetsuo's grip tightened on the sword. The time for hiding was over. They were no longer just running from the Takeda or the court. They were running from the very forces that had shaped the fate of Japan for centuries. The dawn of the final battle had arrived, and with it, an air of inevitability. Tetsuo could feel it in his bones, the weight of the moment. They had come so far, each step marked by blood, sacrifice, and loss. The journey that had started as a quest to protect the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba had now become something much larger, a fight for the soul of Japan itself. It was a fight that could not be avoided. The forces that sought the sword, both the Takeda and the imperial court, as well as the dark power of the Lotus Sect, had converged, and the stage was set. As Tetsuo and his companions stood on the edge of the valley, their eyes fixed on the temple of the Lotus Sect ahead, they could feel the oppressive atmosphere around them. The village, once quiet and peaceful, now seemed to pulse with the dark. Energy, the air thick with the presence of the monks who had been waiting for them. Their chants echoed through the valley, their voices rising in unison, like a dark hymn to a forgotten god. Tetsuo's grip on Kagehira no Tsuba tightened. The sword was no longer just a symbol of the past. It was the key to the future, to the very fate of the land. He had carried it for so long, bearing the weight of its legacy, and now, in the face of the Lotus Sect's dark power, he knew that the final decision had come. "We cannot let them have it," Tetsuo said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "Not now, not ever." Yamato, standing beside him, nodded. His eyes were hard, filled with the same resolve. The Lotus Sect is more than just a cult. They have power beyond what we can comprehend. Their influence on the court, on the future of Japan, is something we cannot ignore. But we can stop them, together. Takeda and Ayumi stood by their side, their weapons drawn and ready. Takeda's bow gleamed in the pale light of dawn, while Ayumi, despite her past betrayal, had proven her loyalty through her actions. They were ready to fight, ready to stand by Tetsuo, no matter the cost. They moved forward, slowly and cautiously, toward the temple. The monks, their faces hidden behind masks, continued their chanting, seemingly unaware of the threat closing in on them. The dark energy around them was palpable, and Tetsuo felt the power of the Lotus Sect like an oppressive weight on his chest. He could feel it in the very air, a presence that sought to break his resolve, to weaken his will. But Tetsuo would not bend. He had come this far, and he would not falter now. As they entered the temple, the atmosphere grew even heavier. The walls of the temple were adorned with intricate carvings, symbols of ancient rites and forgotten gods. The air was thick with incense, the smoke curling upward like a snake, obscuring the light and casting long shadows across the stone floor. The monks had stopped chanting, their heads bowed in reverence as Tetsuo and his companions approached. The heart of the temple, with a lotus sect's leader, a figure cloaked in darkness, awaited them. He stood tall, his features obscured by a mask, his robes flowing like the shadows themselves. His presence was commanding, his aura filled with an unnatural power. This was the man behind the Lotus sect, the one who had led the dark forces that had manipulated the imperial court, the one who had sought to use the sword to reshape Japan in his own image. "Welcome, Tetsuo," the leader's voice rang out, smooth and cold like silk. "I have been expecting you. You have made quite the journey, haven't you? But you've reached the end of the line. The sword is mine now. It belongs to the court, to the empire, and I will see it return to its rightful place." Tetsuo stood tall, his eyes burning with defiance. "The sword is not for you, and it never will be. You've used the court, the Takeda, and even your dark magic to try and control the future of Japan, but you have failed. The sword will never be wielded by those who seek to use it for destruction." The leader's laugh was low, almost mocking. "You truly believe you can stop me? You are nothing more than a relic of the past, a Ronin with a broken sword and a shattered legacy. You are weak, Tetsuo, and in the end, you will fail, just as those before you failed." Tetsuo's hand tightened. Around the hilt of Kagehira no Tsuba, his grip unwavering. "I am not weak, and I will not allow you to turn the sword into an instrument of tyranny. This land deserves more than the dark future you've planned." The leader's expression darkened, his eyes narrowing as he raised his hands in a gesture of command. "So be it," he said coldly. "If you will not surrender the sword, then you will die for it." With that, the monks around them moved into action, their robes swirling like dark shadows as they summoned their magic, calling upon the ancient powers of the Lotus sect. The air around them hummed with dark energy, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Tetsuo stepped forward, his sword raised high. "We will not die here," he said, his voice steady. "We will fight for what is right." The battle that ensued was fierce and unrelenting. The monks moved with unnatural speed, their dark magic swirling around them like a storm. The very earth seemed to shake as they summoned the power of the ancient rites, casting spells that threatened to overwhelm Tetsuo and his companions. But Tetsuo, with Kagehira no Tsuba in his hands, was unstoppable. Each strike was a testament to his resolve, each movement a declaration of defiance against the forces of darkness. Yamato fought beside him, his broad sword cutting through the monks with lethal precision. Takeda's arrows flew true, each one finding its mark and taking down a foe. Ayumi, though weary from her past actions, fought with the ferocity of someone who had nothing left to lose. Her blade was a flash of light in the darkness, cutting through the air with a speed that belied her small frame. But the Lotus sect's leader was not easily defeated. He moved with a grace that belied his age, his dark magic flowing around him like a cloak. He raised his hands, summoning the full force of the sect's power, and the ground beneath them trembled once more. "You cannot defeat me," he hissed, his voice filled with a cold, malevolent fury. "I am the darkness that will bring Japan to its knees." Tetsuo's eyes burned with determination. "You are nothing," he spat, his voice carrying through the temple. "The sword is not yours to command. You will fall just as those before you have fallen." With a final resounding cry, Tetsuo lunged forward, his sword cutting through the dark energy that surrounded the leader. The battle reached its peak in that moment, the air thick with the clash of steel and magic. But in the end, it was Tetsuo's resolve that prevailed. With a single powerful strike, he brought the sword down on the Lotus sect leader, ending the battle and shattering the dark magic that had held the temple in its grip. The temple fell silent, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. The monks, once so powerful, now lay defeated. The leader's body crumpled to the floor, his dark energy dissipating like smoke in the wind. Tetsuo stood over him, his chest heaving with the exertion of the fight. His sword, still gleaming with the remnants of dark magic, was stained with the blood of his enemies. He had won. The sword was safe. But the price of victory had been steep. The road ahead was still uncertain. The Takeda, the court, and the dark forces of Japan still moved in the shadows. And the Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba was still a symbol of power, coveted by those who would use it to shape the future. Tetsuo turned to his companions, his eyes filled with quiet pride and determination. They had fought together, and together they had won. But the battle for Japan's future was not yet over. The sword would always be a symbol, and Tetsuo would continue to protect it, no matter the cost. "We've won," Yamato said quietly, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "But this isn't the end." Tetsuo nodded, his gaze steady. "No, this is just the beginning." The Sword of Kagehira no Tsuba had survived its trials, and so too had Tetsuo and his companions. But the journey was far from finished. The future of Japan still lay in the balance, and the sword would always be its key. The final stand had been fought, but the real war was just beginning.